On Friday, 28th of June 2019, it was announced that the European Commission had reached an agreement with Mercosur to create the largest free trade agreement in its history. And folks, the euphoria felt on the other side of the Atlantic, it was not mild.
Para nosotros también es un día histórico. Este es el acuerdo más importante que hemos firmado en nuestra historia.
Estamos yendo debilitados y a ciegas a un acuerdo que será muy difícil que modifique las condiciones del trabajo en Argentina.
It has taken 20 long years to reach an agreement that affects a population of almost 800 million people and a quarter of the world's GDP. The agreement reached will launch a free trade agreement of the so-called new generation, which means it will deal both with the commerce and several other issues related to public regulations. However, having reached an agreement does not mean that everything is solved. Actually, troubles have only just started. For example, last September the 19th, the Austrian parliament voted against this deal, forcing the Austrian government to veto it at the European Council. Austria could indeed be just the first out of a bunch of countries that may oppose the agreement if it was negotiated. Why does the Austrian parliament want to veto this? What are the advantages and the risks of this free trade agreement between the European Union and Mercosur? And how would this deal impact Latin America? So, dear viewers, we're going to answer these questions, but first, well, we need to know exactly what Mercosur is and the role it's played since it was founded, and indeed, has Mercosur been a success or a bit of a failed experiment?
Common market for America.
The Latin American history of regional integration processes is as long as it is erratic. We have to go a long way back in time, at least to the 1950s, to find the first of Latin America's attempts to unite economically and commercially. In other words, to create something similar to a common market in which they can buy, sell, invest, or move without national borders being an obstacle. Then I can tell you that 60 years later, it still has the same debates and the same objectives, so you could imagine something, and that's that things didn't really go according to plan. The Montevideo Treaty was signed in February of 1960, creating the Latin American Free Trade Association, its most ambitious bet. It was made up of the 10 South American republics and Mexico and had a very clear mission: to eliminate all tariffs and most regional trade obstacles within a maximum period of 10 years. Unfortunately, that goal was never reached. However, folks, while Latin America's economic integration process progressed slower than an arthritic turtle, the rest of the world, it didn't stand still. During the 70s, 80s, and 90s, the European integration project continued to grow. The foundations of the future NAFTA, the free trade agreement between Canada, the United States, and Mexico, were set in place during the late 1980s.
For a president accused of not getting out the big artillery in support of the North American trade agreement, how about this? Down the hall to the White House East Room he came with 3 of his predecessors in tow.
And in that same period, Asian countries decided to take the market by the throat. In general, during the 70s, 80s, and 90s, the entire world took huge strides towards the idea of boosting international trade, something later known as globalization. Even the so-called Uruguay round kicked off in 1986, which would end up paving the way for the World Trade Organization. Yes, it may have been that international frenzy along with the Latin American economic crises that finally encouraged the governments of Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay, and Paraguay to sign the Treaty of Asunción on March 26, 1991, the treaty that established the Southern Common Market, Mercosur.
Consejo del Mercado Común, órgano superior encargado de la conducción política.
But just a moment, because it's all very well to have great intentions, but getting results is a different matter. Almost 3 decades later, despite its name, the Southern Common Market, Mercosur, hasn't managed to become a common market. And that's not even its worst problem, nor its only one. So listen up.
A revisão do protocolo de compras governamentais do Mercosur.
Mercosur, the wannabe.
Let's do an exercise. Look at the information and what do we find? Well, on paper, Mercosur is a huge economic zone. We're talking about an organization that affects almost 13 million square kilometers, almost 300 million inhabitants, and more than 3/4 of all South America's GDP. That's almost $3 trillion. As you can see, Mercosur had all the elements for becoming one of the largest markets on the planet. However, over time, if they've proven anything, it's been their limitations. And this has a lot to do with the spirit in which the economic integration movements in Latin America were born. Allow me to explain. Since the very first plans were put on the table, they were based on what has been known as closed regionalism. That is, eliminating trade tariffs to countries within the bloc while maintaining and even increasing tariffs towards the rest of the world. In the case of Mercosur, this was done through the so-called Common External Tariff, a common tariff applied to imports originating outside Mercosur. With it, they intended to favor intra-regional trade by making imports from outside the bloc more expensive through high tariffs of 15, 20, or even 30%. Of course, that obviously had consequences. So let me explain. Yes, that barrier might help some local producers, such as Argentine wheat producers, but in general, all those restrictions, they stopped international investment, made buying technology much more expensive, and prevented Mercosur countries from joining international production chains. And although many politicians don't realize this, that's how the world works. Each part of a product is simply made in a different place. Therefore, if you prevent or punish the arrival of supplies that manufacturers need with tariffs, then, well, you get left out. But it doesn't end there. In the end, of course, if you defend protectionism against the rest of the world, what's to stop you doing it to your own neighbors? And that's precisely what happened with Mercosur. They have been unable to create a true common market because, in the end, neither the various governments of Brazil nor the different Argentine governments have ever believed in international trade as a tool to grow. This has caused a situation in which, unlike the European Union, customs between the Mercosur member countries themselves have not disappeared.
Argentina and Uruguay are members of Mercosur. In theory, internal borders should not exist in Mercosur. In practice, customs, sanitation inspections, and other paperwork mean that the trucks are delayed for up to 24 hours. Oscar Terzaghi to The Economist.
Want another example? Well, here's a question, and let me see if you get it right. China is the country to which Argentina applies the strictest anti-dumping measures as a way to hinder imports. Can you guess the second country to which Argentina applies the most anti-dumping measures? 3, 2, 1. Well, you might be surprised that the answer is none other than Brazil. Yep, you heard that correctly. With friends like these, who needs enemies? The fact is that trade doesn't depend on tariffs alone, not at all. In fact, Latin America in general has very few regional trade tariffs, but, well, trade restrictions, they can go much further than that. Anti-dumping rights, automatically demanding and not granting import licenses, exchange rate interventions, rules of origin, etc., etc. At the end of the day, governments have a lot of room to maneuver when there isn't a real common market. In the end, between one thing and another, the political leaders of Mercosur have managed to make this one of the least integrated commercial areas on the planet.
You have to look hard to find another trade agreement with as little intrazone growth as Mercosur. Guillermo Tolosa, executive director of the Uruguayan think tank Center for Economic and Social Policy Research. More than an internal free trade area, Mercosur is a free domestic protectionism area. Argentina has applied as many protectionist measures as it could against the other members, and Brazil didn't help much either. Roberto Caicedo.
In fact, check out how Argentina's exports to Brazil have evolved over recent years. However, folks, all this seems to be finally changing, and that's exactly where the agreement with the European Union comes in.
Tardamos 20 años, pero logramos llegar a un momento del tiempo en el cual encontramos muchos líderes con buena voluntad para transformar en esto una realidad.
Towards a new Mercosur.
Mercosur was born lame. Beyond the great political speeches, the truth is that it never really had much hope of achieving widespread integration. But despite everything, the first years, they weren't bad. Not at all, in fact. The volume of trade between Mercosur countries multiplied by 3 from 8% of all trade in 1991 to 25% in 1998. Everything indicated that despite their limitations, things could go reasonably well. However, after the year 2000, everything got rather complicated. The new Latin American political leaders, Ernesto Kirchner, Lula da Silva, and Barre Vazquez, changed Mercosur's economic idea, fundamentally turning it into a political body. They even created a parliament, the Mercosur Parliament. Basically, at this time of closed regionalism, they moved on to what leftist theorists themselves have called post-hegemonic regionalism. What isn't very clear is what this means. It was precisely at this time that Argentina, Brazil, and Uruguay welcomed Venezuela into Mercosur through Hugo Chavez and began the process of integrating Bolivia. Although it is true that Venezuela was indefinitely suspended in 2017. The problem with all this is that at a time when Mercosur hasn't yet achieved economic integration, well, the economy was hit so hard that an organization called Southern Market became almost everything except an integrated market. That's how the 25% of trade weight between Mercosur members in 1998 fell to just over 13% in 2017. To give you a better idea, in the European Union, this number amounts to 64%, 5 times more. But now, with the arrival of new leaders like Bolsonaro and Macri, the bloc seems to have changed course. The first great achievement of this new strategy has been the agreement with the European Union by signing one of the largest free trade agreements ever. We're talking about the involvement of 32 countries, almost 800 million people, and $19 trillion of GDP. And folks, this opens the region up to huge opportunities, especially for Mercosur countries.
Historical opportunity.
We still don't know all the details, nor whether the agreement will be immediately applied, but what's already on the table sounds very, very good. See, according to the agreement reached, the European Union will eliminate tariffs for 92% of Mercosur's exports and will also grant access to preferential conditions to an extra 7.5%. This means that less than 1% of the products that Mercosur sells to the European Union will be left out of the agreement. And obviously, this will greatly boost the competitiveness of South American companies. And watch out, because the European Union is a commercial colossus that devours products from all over the world.
The EU is a huge market with 500 million inhabitants that represents 20% of the world economy. It's the biggest investor with a stock that exceeds 30% of global investments and imports 17% of all the world's purchases of goods and services, from an Argentine government report.
Each year, the European Union spends more than $2 billion on all kinds of products from the rest of the world. Well, of this entire amount, a little more than 2% comes from the South American bloc. Each year, the European Union imports more from South Korea than from all of the Mercosur countries put together. However, now this agreement gives Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay, and Paraguay the chance to get a bigger and bigger slice of the pie. Think about what this means, for example, for agriculture, the sector that exports the most to Europe. With this agreement, 99% of its exports to the EU will be liberalized, and even more than 80% will be free of any tariff. And don't forget that Europe imports more than $120 billion in agri-food products every year. We're talking about huge business here. On the other hand, 91% of European Union exports to Mercosur will also be duty-free. This means that, for example, Brazilian, Argentine, Uruguayan, and Paraguayan companies will be able to access German technology and machines with greater ease and better terms. Of course, the agreement won't be fully implemented for 15 years, though. Until then, we'll see a progressive application, with the idea of giving the South American countries time to implement the reforms that they need in order to be able to compete. This is especially critical in Argentina's case. That's why the bulk of European exports will be completely liberalized within 10 to 15 years. That is, Mercosur will benefit from this agreement much earlier than most European companies. In fact, once the agreement is enforced, 76% of Mercosur's exports will be duty-free, compared to only 13% of European exports. And Argentinian politicians still complain. It's pretty incredible.
Estamos yendo debilitados y a ciegas a un acuerdo que será muy difícil que modifique las condiciones del trabajo en Argentina.
Of course, there's a very important point that we should stress here. A free trade agreement is an opportunity, but it's also a risk if countries decide not to compete. Free trade demands competition. There are no excuses because the agreement will also establish its own methodology. That is, as long as the agreement is enforced, governments cannot boycott trading with foreign companies, or at least they'll be much more limited in doing so. And everything doesn't end with the EU. Now Mercosur wants to make similar agreements with Korea, Singapore, Canada, EFTA countries, and even the United States. And of course, doing what they should have done in the first place also improves the economic integration of their own member countries. So will we soon see a true common South American market? And is Mercosur finally taking off? And the most important question, will this agreement between Mercosur and the European Union be able to make Austria and other hesitant EU member states come together? Well, only time will tell. So I really hope you enjoyed this video. Please do hit that like button if you did, and don't forget to subscribe for brand new videos. Also, do check out our friends at the Reconsider Media podcast. They provided the vocals in this episode that were not mine. Also, this channel is possible because of Patreon and our patrons on that platform. Please do consider joining them and supporting our mission of providing independent political coverage. And as always, I'll see you next time.
If you want to learn more about politics and world affairs and hear some more of my lovely voice, come check out the Reconsider podcast, where we don't do the thinking for you. Find Reconsider at www.reconsidermedia.com or on Apple or Google Play or your favorite podcatcher.